Now, Jesus and his disciples went from Bethsaida and passed through Galilee, but Jesus did not want anyone to know it. Jesus didn't want anyone to know it. Now, Jesus rarely sought attention for himself. The world that I live in, the world that you live in, we would barely understand this. I live in a world that says you have to market yourself, you have to put yourself out there. It seems strange and illogical to be a public figure like Jesus or a public teacher like Jesus and not have some sense of, well, seeking a level of attention in the world. But this was Jesus' way. He just didn't need to be the center of attention. In fact, this avoidance of attention is so prevalent in the Gospels that theologians have spent years and written pages and book after book after book of what they call the messianic secret. Why Jesus wanted to keep his place and his existence and his geographic location and his identity a secret. So in Matthew's Gospel, he tells his disciples, "Tell no one who I am." In Mark's Gospel, he moves from town to town but doesn't want people to know that he's there. In Luke's Gospel, he goes to the mountains to be alone and get away from the crowds. In John's Gospel, he tells the disciples, "I am the Messiah, but I don't want you to tell anybody." The messianic secret. Shh. So theologians have come up with all sorts of explanations for this. Why does Jesus do this? Well, maybe he thinks he's going to be killed. Or maybe he's worried his disciples will be killed. Or maybe he didn't think people really understood who he was and he didn't want them proclaiming something they didn't understand. Or maybe it's just as simple as he was an eye on the Myers-Briggs and he just wanted to be left alone. Host of theories. The fact remains, Jesus is so averse to being the center of attention that Jesus is not baptized alone. He just goes and gets in line with everybody else. Jesus doesn't do ministry alone. He calls disciples and followers to go with him. Jesus doesn't even die alone. He is crucified among thieves. Jesus and his disciples went from Bethsaida and passed through Galilee, but he did not want anyone to know it because attention just wasn't something that Jesus sought for himself. Now, his disciples, on the other hand, clamored for attention. So when they came to Capernaum and when Jesus was in the house, he asked them, "What were you all arguing about on the way?" And they were silent because they had been arguing among themselves about who was the greatest. Is that hilarious? I mean, is that silly? Is that hilariously silly? I think it's amazing. In fact, I was just kind of imagining it this past week. Could you imagine the church staff being on break on Wednesday morning at 9:15? We're in the break room talking. You walk through the hallway. We all walk out, and you say, "What were you all talking about in there?" "We were arguing over who was the greatest." Kendra thinks she's the greatest because she is great with child, so that makes her great. Kyle thinks he's the greatest because he's won numerous music industry awards. Booty thinks he's the greatest. He's a TV ninja. I personally think I'm the greatest. I had a poem published in Highlights magazine in 3rd grade. And that puts me far beyond most of them. Vivian thinks she's the greatest in her own words. Do I need a reason? I mean, this sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? I mean, who would sit around and talk about who is the greatest? This is what happened with the disciples, not just once, but happens at least 3 times in the Gospels. Of course, we modern disciples aren't much better. It's interesting how you can drive into a lot of major cities, and just as you're on the outskirts of the city, there's a billboard with a pastor's picture on it advertising a church. Have you seen these? We don't have one. Yet. I remember in the early 90s, First Baptist Church Dallas had fallen into a financial slump. They were behind on their budget. They were behind on their mission gifts. They were operating on a deficit. And then Senior Minister W.A. Criswell devised a plan to supplement the budget. I don't know if you remember this, Tim, being a Texan. But he decided that he would have 18-inch statues of himself made, and they were sold for $59.99 a piece to the church and to the community to supplement the budget. Now, I was the pastor at First Baptist Church in Baxley, Georgia at the time, and I can still remember my sermon from the Sunday after I read that article where I stood before the church and said, I don't care how bad our finances get. I don't care how far behind we get in the budget. I don't care how far we are away from meeting our missions goals. Don't you ever sell an 18-inch statue of me to make up money in the church. I want mine at least 24 inches, 26. I've got to have some size to it. We're all guilty of needing to clamor for a little attention. But in the work of Jesus, in the work of the church, who should get the attention? Jesus sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, now whoever wants to be first must be last, be servant of all. And then he took a little child and put it among them. He took a little child and put it among them. And then he took it into his arms, and he said to them, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. He put a child among them. Now, we think of this as a nice, sweet little thing, taking a child and putting it among them. There is nothing more uncomfortable to a bunch of Jewish men than to have a child put among them. This is not a sweet stained glass window picture. This is putting an unclean child in the middle of a group of Jewish men. Look, I found a dead bug. That makes you unclean. I pee-pee my pull-ups. That makes you unclean. Dog slobber tastes funny. That makes you unclean. The last thing a group of Jewish men who are trying to stay pure so that they can worship in the temple as sanctified individuals wants is a child among them. It's uncomfortable. And that's why the Jewish women cared for the children. The men wanted to stay clean. I received my doctorate at Columbia Theological Seminary in 1991. I drove home with my new doctoral robe with the 3 bars on both sleeves. I kept it on and drove all the way home in it. Met my wife at the door. She handed me our oldest daughter, who was 4 years old at the time, and this is verbatim. I said, Lauren, do you like Daddy's new robe? And she said, I've got boogies, and wiped her nose on the sleeve of my robe. Listen, he put a child among them, an unclean child. And children aren't just unclean, they are needy. I love baby dedications. You know that I do. I enjoy carrying those children around the sanctuary and talking to them about the promises that we make to them as a faith family. I have friends who have seen me do that who are ministers. They try it once, usually. And they call me and they say, I am never going to do that again. That child started crying. I didn't know if they needed a diaper or needed a passy or needed a pat on the back or needed me to talk differently to them. I couldn't figure out what they needed, and I wasn't comfortable, and I'm never going to do it again. Children are unclean and needy. But the real discomfort around children comes from the way they demand us to identify with them and live in their world. The real discomfort with children is the way they demand that we live in their world and identify with them. I have a granddaughter named Harper, for those of you who haven't heard. We were at the beach this summer. I asked Harper one morning, I said, Harper, what do you want Pop to cook you for breakfast today? And she looked at me and she said, you're not Pop, you're Cookie Monster. I said, no, right now I need to be Pop because I'm cooking breakfast. What do you want Pop to make for you this morning? And she goes into this crying, almost shaking, fitful rage. You're not Pop today, you're Cookie Monster. And I spent the whole day responding to every question. Cookies, I want cookies. I don't even like cookies. But she's a child. And she needed me to get on the floor and identify with her world and live in her world. This is not a picture of welcoming just children. This is Jesus' way of saying that the people who need the attention among you are the ones who are least comfortable to you. That the work of the church, the work of the followers of Christ, shouldn't even be to give Jesus the attention because he apparently doesn't want it. And it certainly doesn't have anything to do with claiming attention for ourselves. At our best, we give attention to those who make us the most uncomfortable. At our best, we give our attention to those who make us the most uncomfortable. Those that the world might consider unclean or needy or hard to understand, but people who want us to identify with them and understand and live in their world. In 1986, 5 years before I received my robe, Henry Nouwen laid down his academic robe. Just took it off and laid it down. He had been the author of numerous books, best-selling books. He had been a professor at Notre Dame and Yale and Harvard. He was the most sought-after speaker in the world, and he laid down his academic robes and became a house parent and a resident assistant at L'Arche Community for mentally disabled adult men. And Henry Nouwen spent the last chapter of his life feeding men who couldn't feed themselves, dressing them in the morning, getting them in their PJs at night, changing their adult diapers, giving them baths, engaging in conversations far below his vocabulary level. But it's a population, he said, with whom he felt very uncomfortable. For a lot of people, unclean, needy, hard to understand. But Henry said in one of his diary entries, giving attention to these men has restored my purpose in life and restored my worn-out faith in God. You know, as people of faith, it is easy to give Jesus attention. Yeah, we love to sing and pray and preach, but the irony is Jesus really could care less about the attention. We enjoy garnering some attention for ourselves. We all like to be affirmed for who we are and what we do. But I think the church is at her best when we are embracing those who make us the most uncomfortable. It is at that point that we are reflecting the God who loved the whole world.